So we're going to be talking about the problem of immigration. And that's a complex problem, and it's one that seems to be occurring in a number of places throughout the world. So we thought this would just be a good one for us to take a stab at. So in the participation guide for September 19th, part 1, round 1 starts by identifying the purpose, and you start by identifying the conflict. So how would you define the conflict? And it's important that we define it the same way eventually, because if we don't all see the conflict as the same, we're not going to find a solution that we think will work, because we're not solving the same problem. Mm-hmm. So what would you say are some aspects of the conflict, or what do you think the conflict is?
I would say that generally people see other people as a threat.
Okay. In what way do they see them as a threat?
There is competition for resources, competition for money, fear, a certain amount of fear of cultural differences, language differences.
Okay. And perhaps some of those cultures might take over or might influence the current culture.
Yeah,
sometimes
kind
that's
of
a problem.
degrading of national identity.
Okay. Diane, what do you?
Well, another aspect of the problem is there are people arriving at our borders, and there's no agreed upon method really for handling what happens when they come, especially when they come in larger numbers, as has been increasing over the years. Mm-hmm. And so there's no agreed upon solution, and it's just been kind of let go. The government hasn't come up with any solution, and so some of the people have just crossed the border and come in. Mm-hmm. So we have a conflict with people who have not become citizens or have not been granted asylum or are here illegally, which, as I understand it, is a misdemeanor, not a shootable offense.
Oh,
so
I didn't even know, what class of offense it would be, but I think you're right, because I think one of the conflicts that instantly becomes apparent is that they might be breaking the law. So do we enforce the laws? But at the same time, it's a group of people who are arriving that are desperate. They have no place to go, and they have definite, humanitarian needs that need to be met. So, do we say, well, you're breaking the law and not help them, or do we help them knowing that eventually it might be breaking the law because they came illegally?
Right. And part of many people's perspective is that the situation as it exists right now, there hasn't been humanitarian treatment of the people who are arriving, and so.
And that may go back to what you were saying, and that the resources aren't set up there.
Right.
They didn't know it was going to happen, or not soon enough, or there was no plan in place for how to address large numbers of people arriving at the border.
There seem to be, I think there should be a separate set of rules, so to speak, for refugees versus immigrants. And so there's some question in my mind about, what's happening on the border. Are the people coming across in such numbers refugees? I mean, are they legitimately fleeing for their lives, or are they coming for economic gain? And I don't know how the laws cover those differences.
Mm-hmm.
There's the whole moral question too. I mean, at bottom line, these are people who need help, and so in my mind, part of it is, why are we even bothering to look at the laws or think about the differences? Basically, they're people who need help. So as one human to another, there should be a way to accommodate them.
Mm-hmm. And the truth being that we're all immigrants. None of us, I don't think any of us sitting here have the Native American background. So we've all come, and I always think, I I grew up in New Jersey, so the Statue of Liberty is right there, and give me you're tired, you're poor, you're rest, huddled masses, you're yearning to be free. That's been part of how many people
The American
have
way.
seen the American
Exactly.
dream, and so
Exactly.
that there isn't even common ground about that idea anymore.
And it could be too, I think sometimes there's a question about whether some of the people coming are really in need, because you hear about, borrowing children, or, they bring children with them that aren't their children so that they can get into the United States, that way. But, so it's a very complex problem.
It is.
Are there any other aspects to it that?
I think there is a need, for more workers, even though we now have low unemployment. But there are many people still within the country who don't have jobs, but they've kind of given up on the unemployment route, so they don't come out in the statistics. But there's a perception that the immigrants coming are taking jobs, but the reality is that farmers, for example, are posting jobs to harvest their fields, and they can't get people to do it.
Right.
And so we really can't fill many of the jobs that are needed with our own population.
Okay. So there is a need, even though people say, well, they're taking other people's jobs, they're perhaps not taking other people's jobs, they're taking jobs that somebody else won't do or can't do, or that sort of thing. And I think too, something that I've noticed is it just seems like, as you mentioned, it's a humanitarian problem, and sometimes we don't handle it with much empathy. Maybe we don't treat them with respect, or we don't treat them as though it could be us in that predicament, and how would we want to be treated, whether it's with respect and empathy, or just meeting basic needs, or whatever. But so I think that's part of the issue too, whether it's legal or not. We don't have to be disrespectful or
Separating families.
Right. That's
There's the matter of justice and equity in pay too. I mean, if we allow people to come in the country and work these jobs that it seems no one else wants, then they should be paid fairly and have good working conditions. And I think that's
not always the truth.
Yeah,
right.
That's a problem. It's part of the issue too.
So I don't know whether we're just scratching the surface, but as you can see, it's a very complex issue, and one that if we're not all identifying the same aspect of what we're trying to solve here, it's going to be next to impossible to find a solution.
Well, then another angle is there are certain topics that have become politically charged. So I mean, if you just say the word immigration in a group of people who are not in agreement politically, then you immediately get a lot of fiery emotions and not much conversation at all. And politicians deliberately use it as a charged issue.
Right.
On both sides of the arguments.
Right, on all sides.
All kinds of ways. So it's the complexity is what makes it so hard to solve.
And that's kind of what takes us to the next question, or what are your goals for this conversation? And just for the sake of some brevity, we would need to decide, what aspect of this problem would we want to try to attack or to address. Or it could just be that our goal for this conversation is just to identify all the different aspects of the problem. But it could also be that we want to take one part of it and see, well, how could we at least address that? Whether we want to look at what the laws are, or whether we want to look at how could we provide humanitarian aid. But anyway, you'd want to establish what your goals are for this conversation, so that we can kind of stay on task with that. But moving on to round two, the passion, because you both mentioned, that there's a lot of emotion in dealing with this particular topic. So what do you think are the emotions that either you experience when this topic comes up, or what are some of the emotions that you think most people experience? And there's a list on the page of mad, sad, glad, surprise, afraid, disgust. You might think that there's a lot of other emotions, but a lot of them are just a different way of saying this, or it's kind of like a piece of that. Which emotions do you think people are most likely to feel with this topic?
I feel sad personally.
Sad?
So I
Okay.
think, and I've heard other people express some of that also.
Okay.
Well, and I would say disgust too,
Mhm.
because the laws and politicians who, in my mind, should be managing the process are not. They're not making decisions
We don't
that would
be
move
making
toward humane solutions.
Okay.
They're not providing resources. So
And I
I'm
think
angry.
there's also been some disgust at how we've seen people being treated.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, the
Anger.
conditions they're being held in.
Anger.
Yeah, definitely mad.
Yes.
Yeah.
But maybe when I look at people themselves, the refugees, especially from the border, I'm amazed at how determined they are, and how far they come
Mhm.
under dire circumstances to protect their
I
families.
know, with nothing but what they have on their back.
It's
Because we
amazing.
have a lot of immigrants who have money, and it's easy for some people anyway to pay thousands of dollars
Mhm.
to go through the visa process to come here to work
Right.
here as engineers. But the people that we see coming from the border are, really determined, strong people.
Mhm.
I have a lot of sympathy for them.
I think afraid is maybe one of the other emotions
Yes, I
that
think there's a
people-
lot of fear.
Yeah,
absolutely.
fear about what it will mean in the future, or fear about it might get out of control, or
Right.
or they might not have, might have some effect on them, that kind of thing.
Right.
How do you think these emotions could keep you from listening? So in this first part, we're exploring, what are the things that are keeping you from listening? So how do you think strong emotion keeps you from listening to your fullest potential?
Well, sometimes it's because you're battling to control your emotions.
Okay.
And so you're spending your energy and your thought process of how do I respond to this, where my natural first impression, first response might be not a helpful one.
Okay.
I don't want to make the situation worse.
So if I feel a lot of sympathy, empathy for people, but someone says, something like, those people are taking our jobs, then I feel angry, and I'm more likely to shut down and not try to.
Yeah, and I
reconcile.
think that's where I see a lot of the problem is that it becomes a fight to win,
Right.
not to solve the problem.
Right.
But, I'm right and you're wrong, so we have to do it this way. Whereas we've just already looked at how complex it is. But if you engage with somebody who that's their goal is to fight to win, then they don't listen at all. They listen for what they can argue with, or how they can shoot down what you're saying, or how they can intimidate you to not say anything. So I think that's one that I think
And that
keeps people.
can totally railroad the situation, the conversation, and so you don't get anywhere near beginning to talk about any common ground or
It seems like that's what
solutions.
happens oftentimes when politics are involved.
Oh, yeah.
It becomes a fight to be in the right. But,
Right, and before, with the thought being, we have to get all of that resolved before we can come up with solutions, which
Mhm.
I would question whether that's true.
Right. Can you think of anything that you could do in the course of a conversation that might help alleviate the emotions?
Well, you can reflect back, I hear you saying that you're feeling a lot of fear.
And you just touched on something that I think is really important, and that is to recognize and name the emotion. It sounds like I can see that you're really angry about this, or it sounds like you're maybe a little afraid of what might happen or something, but to actually recognize the emotion, because sometimes that's the important part of the message is the emotion, how I feel about this, not so much what I'm saying, but how I feel about it.
And it lets the other person know at least you've heard what they're saying.
I think another technique is taking a break. Sometimes we get so spiraled up, that you just have to take a break to let things calm down. Okay,
Sometimes I think
I'm gonna
just-
turn this off for just a
yeah.
minute, and then we'll move to the round 3, and then we can